What's good, YouTube? It's me, your boy Squiddy, back in another video. Today I want to talk about the decks that have the highest possibility of actually winning the WCQs that are upcoming for both Euros and also North America in the next month. So without further ado, let's dive in. The first deck at the forefront of everyone's foresight is probably KASHTIRA, because this deck is just crazy. It barely got hit in the ban list. It doesn't have the explosive opening as it did previously, where you're able to lock a bunch of zones with Diablosis. However, the deck is still ultra consistent in terms of what it does. It's still one card, multiple one-card starters that allow you to go full combo into your Arise Heart. It doesn't matter that you lost Arise Heart, because all you really have to do is set up one Arise Heart on the opening turn. And if your opening is solid enough where your opponent has to burn multiple cards in order to break that board, then on the crackback, you're able to break their board and probably either OTK them or destroy their entire card advantage and then set up a board. Even without Arise Heart, it doesn't matter. You have cards like Unicorn, Fenrir, Scareclaw to push for damage, or even just leaving them on board is threatening enough because they have the trigger effects to disrupt your opponent. There are also other powerful XYZs like Dark Arm Dragon of Annihilation, which you can use to pop your opponent's board and then swing for game on the crackback on the second turn. So the deck is still one of the most solid decks. It barely lost anything in terms of consistency besides a Unicorn loss, which didn't really hurt anyways. The deck was already having some consistency issues before, so I don't think the Unicorn really took away anything along that line. You're still playing like Pot of Prosperity and probably Pot of Desires as well, just because you want to start your engine no matter what. The deck is no doubt a little weaker and now a little more grounded, so a lot more decks can compete with it, but I think it's still consistent, like probably the most consistent, most solid deck to play in a 10+ round tournament. And it just won the France Nationals with over 2,500 people, so that's just testimony to the fact that this deck is just ultra solid, it's ultra capable. The times that you can play that you don't break, you're probably going to have a good chance of winning, and you're going to be able to play at least every game because these monsters all do so much on their own. You're basically able to start your engine again with one card, and that's common theme in Yu-Gi-Oh! I feel like the good decks, the tier 1 decks, all have to have one card starters that can tap into your full combo, and then the rest of your hand is either non-engine or other engine pieces that contribute and solidify that foundation of that one card if it gets interrupted. So if your opponent uses something like an Imperm on a Fenrir or a Unicorn, you might have like a Theosis or like a Birth to follow up and continue contributing, doing that same line of play you would have done previously with the one card. So when we're talking about a round tournament, Swiss like 10, 11, 12 rounds, this is a type of deck that is probably the best to beat what's in the metagame. Even though people are preparing for it, it's still like just has a lot of options. You can easily adapt with your side deck. You can adapt to a matchup. It doesn't have any bad matchups. It has a lot of good matchups, including the decks that are resilient, reliant on the graveyard, things like the rogue decks, tier elements. Even Runicks have a hard chance against Arise Heart, especially when you equip it with something like the Infinitrack Goliath, so it cannot be destroyed by card effects, so they have to burn 2 cards in order to get rid of the Arise Heart. They're probably not killing you that turn because they skip their battle phase, and then on the crackback, you're able to dismantle the board after they've whittled down their resources in order to break your initial board. So it's just one of those decks that's obviously very, very solid. The caveat is if you choose to play this for the WCQ, there's definitely a target on your back because everyone knows this deck is still good again, and the Nationals in France and also the Regionals were no exception to proving that. So everyone's going to be citing a lot of hate, so just got to be prepared for that in terms of the metagame. But we also have to talk about RUNICK, because this is a deck that did not get hit at all on the ban list. Konami did like a very lenient job. They only hit RUNICK Fountain to 2, but it was already played at 2. So I think they wanted to predict the metagame and assume that people would try and play pure RUNICKs just like they did in the OCG, or maybe it was an OCG influence. I don't know, but RUNICK Fountain 2, all we know, that did nothing to the TCG. People are still continuing to play the RUNICKs with other engines, other power engines, including the Sprites and the Live Twins, which is the most powerful that I've seen so far, as well as a for hire engine, which is really unique because you're able to make use of the Link monsters like Donner Dagger for hire. It's not just a pop like everyone's accustomed to when it was played in KASHTIRA. This also has another effect where you contribute the monster and special summon a for hire from your hand or graveyard with a different original name. Then if you tribute a Link monster, aka itself, you can special summon one more monster, so you can essentially special summon back 2 for higher monsters and trigger their abilities because they summon at the same time. And that culminates into Fogel Justice for hire, which allows you to draw multiple cards, okay? You guys can draw 3 cards off of this, with 3 cards off of Fountain, and then other cards as well. You're using other cards to add cards to your hand, gain advantage, and you're drawing a bunch of cards in one turn. So it's an ultimate control deck that is snowballing into plethora of advantage, endless advantage. That's basically what the Runicks do, right? And this is definitely going to be one of the most popular decks, in my opinion, because they're so versatile. The number one thing about Runicks that people love is the fact that their non-engine is also embedded within their engine. So you're playing cards that are already basically non-engine in the form of the Freezing Chains, which is basically a pseudo for Rin Chalice. This is a card that can allow you to further your plays by special summoning your Runicks fusion monsters from the extra deck, or just negating a monster. And then they have Flashing Fire, which is also an in-engine, non-engine, because it destroys a special summon monster, aka baiting out a negate. And then of course they have Runicks Destruction, which is really nice because it's a built-in floodgate killer for things like skill drain, right? Like you're playing against cards like Golden Match, there can be only one skill drain, cards that are prevalent in the metagame right now, you can just pop it. In addition to popping things like Birth or any field spells that might add any continuous spell cards that get in the way. So this is just like an ultra consistent deck, in addition to having the resources and utility to combat things that you would normally lose to playing any other deck in game one. For example, things like skill drain, or there can be only one, right? So having these inside of your deck just baked in is just really unique. So you don't lose, you don't auto concede game ones. You can win and grind back even if you're on the back burner, if you were going second staring down like a skill drain. So that's why I think this deck is really, really cool. In addition to the Sprite package, obviously giving you multiple negates with red and carrot is also something to be highly threatening in this metagame. The key thing is, the key takeaway is people are going to be siding cards to get rid of Runick Fountain as well as your board. So like Dark Ruler, everyone's playing Dark Ruler, everyone's playing Cosmics. So you just kind of have to watch out for that. And also this deck has a lot of technical play. It's a lot more technical almost than KASHTIRA in my opinion, because you're kind of juggling how you want to sequence your plays to play around hand traps, but also whether or not you want to activate your Runick cards, because you're skipping battle phases. So you kind of have to think 1 or 2 turns ahead to make sure that you're activating the right sequencing, you're drawing the right cards, you're activating the right cards, and building the right board to mount a defense against your opponent, as well as be able to win, especially with the clock burning down when you're skipping your battle phase, right? So you have to kind of juggle all those things. It's a highly technical deck. So if you're playing like 10 or 11 rounds with this deck, you're probably going to get very tired throughout the course of the day. And at some point, you might start to drop and start making misplays. So that's just one thing to worry about. If your technical play is not solid with a deck like this, then you probably don't want to enter an actual WCQ, a premier event with this, because you could start to get some mental fatigue, which in turn causes your play to be a lot worse because you picked a deck that has high technical ceiling. So that's just one thing to keep note of. But this is still going to be one of the most popular decks, so make sure you guys have your Dark Rulers and your Cosmic Cyclones and whatever else ready to combat this deck. The other top 3 deck that I think is decent enough to win is probably Labyrinth. So this deck is previously more of a floodgate deck, but now everyone has caught on to the fact that the furnitures exist, and these cards are amazing because you get to set up your engine, but these cards also come back when you use your in-engine traps to bounce back monsters, whether that's your own or your opponent's, and then you can then use them as link material, as fodder for powerful cards like Chaos Angel as well, so you can start banishing things. And you can also recycle your Chaos Angel with things like the Muckracker from the Underworld as well. So Chaos Angel is actually not an effect that gets banished when it's synchro summoned, but it also gets the effect when it's special summoned, even off of Muckracker. So you're continuously dropping big beaters on the board, whittling down your opponent's resources with your traps, and you're being able to search a utility traps using Lady of the Labyrinth of the Silver Castle by setting cards like D-Barrier, setting cards like the Viruses. You have Eradicator against certain matchups that plays a lot of spells like Runicks. So you also have like a lot of built-in engine pieces that allow you to beat every matchup in game 1, allow you to grind the game as well. The thing with this deck is it's also quite hard to play. You have to sequence your traps exactly right. You have to sequence all of your cards. You can't really slip up with a control deck like this, because the minute you make one wrong play, it feels like your opponent could just take advantage of what you did and then mount a huge board, and all of a sudden you can't win anymore. So you have to be very particular what you're using, when you're using the effects, when you're summoning Labyrinth, when you're chaining, for example, because there are a lot of intricacies in this deck that your opponent, if they're a skilled player, they can probably play around, especially with the fact that Lady Labyrinth is a quick effect, so they can obviously chain block it, so you can't set traps from your graveyard. So little things like that make this deck quite hard to play as well. But I think this deck actually has a very good chance of winning because you're able to play a lot of powerful hand traps. You're able to recycle a lot of the powerful hand traps like the Bystials using the Big Welcome Labyrinth. And then on top of all of that, you get to play some beatdown if you're playing like skill drain. You know, you're playing cards that are basically auto win in certain matchups by just flipping them. So those are just like key things to know about this deck. If you guys are going to the event, definitely make sure you have side deck cards for this deck. Definitely make sure you guys have cosmics or anything else that might stop floodgates, or any cards that might get in your way when you are playing against this deck. So just keynote there about things. Also, Eradicator is definitely a powerful card that I think we'll see a lot of play in the upcoming events, so just be aware of that. There are also some other decks that are, I think, potential. Like, I don't think they're like nearly top 3, but they're almost there, almost good enough to win an event. For example, Dragon Link, we know this got second place. I think it was Mathieu Bricard, the French player that previously won with Dragon Link last year in the French Nats, also came second place, barely losing out to KASHTIRA in the finals in this year's Nationals with over 2,500 people again. So that's an achievement of its own. But after watching his deck profile, he did say he dodged KASHTIRA and only played 2 KASHTIRA that entire tournament, one of which he lost to in the final. So I know that KASHTIRA is probably a bad matchup for this deck, as they're banishing everything and you have a lot of Bystials in your deck. But this deck's still explosive enough. You're making powerful monsters, you're making powerful link monsters like the Borreload, who can negate monster effects, and not a lot of people have outs to the Borrel and Dragon rather, so it's not easy to take care of if you don't have something like an Imprim or a Talents. And this deck is just very, very, very grindy. It's not only a combo deck, but it's also somewhat of a control deck now, because you can just play Heraldic Seals and then try and control the game from there. Special summoning Magnemut each turn. You have things like the Bystial spell cards as well, the Branded, Regained, cards that allow you to recycle your Magnemuts and constantly trigger them, so you're adding back any card in the end phase from your deck basically, because this can add any dragon, not just Bystials, right? So it's a never-ending cycle of dragons, and if you try to play the grind game with them, it's really, really hard because they're gaining a bunch of resources. They're also able to use Branded Beast, which they can set up and constantly loop the regain. They can get this on the field with Lubellion and then start to pop your monsters, pop your cards. So you're kind of on the back burner. If you try to drag out the game, you're probably not going to win against these guys, just because the fact that it's basically like a gadgets deck. They're adding cards off Magnemut and then popping your cards, drawing cards off of Regain, using Beast to as fodder for the things that are reborn off of Regain. So the deck is actually quite scary, especially in a grind game situation, and I would think that the deck definitely has the tools to win, but the only thing is it has a tough matchup against KASHTIRA, so that depends on whether there are a lot of KASHTIRA in the room and then how many KASHTIRA they're going to be up against for this deck to actually thrive. The other decks that I want to talk about is also the Sunseed / Rika deck. I think this deck is actually very, very underestimated. A lot of people don't know about this deck. It seems like no one really wants to read these cards. In fact, I don't even know what the full combo of these cards do yet. It's just like a bit convoluted for me even. But I know that with one Sunseed, one little bit of seed, they can build an entire forest of huge monsters, interactions, negates that you just can't deal with. You're not going to escape out of the forest if they're able to grow to that level. So this deck is actually really resilient. They play a lot of cards like the Rikas, which are actually quite good in a metagame which relies on monsters to start your combos. Things like KASHTIRA relying on one monster, which you can easily interrupt using things like the Rika field spell, tributing their cards with Rika Glamour on your turn, for example, just to whittle down their board. You have like the Rika Teardrop Princess, which tributes as a quick effect as well. So there are so many cards that kind of interrupt the opponent's monsters, the things that are 1-for-1 starters, especially in this metagame. So it's very, very good. Even if you hand trap this deck and they're setting up the Rika Sheet plus the Rika Field Spell, it could be really, really hard for certain decks to push through that, because they have like at least a 2-card disrupt on top of the Rika cards that they have in the graveyard, like the Rika Princess, which allows you to negate monster effects. And it seems like they have a bunch of extenders as well that allow them to push through your hand traps. So there isn't really anything that is a catch-all against this deck. It's just a deck that like people severely underestimate and kind of forget about. They don't know how to play against it. And then the next thing you know, you're kind of being overwhelmed by the resources. So I would highly recommend people to kind of read the cards, kind of see the combo lines, and see some combo videos online to get a good idea of how this deck works, because it could come out of nowhere. This did win a YCS previously last year, guys, so don't forget that this deck is definitely threatening. But always try to stop like their monsters, try to keep their monsters off the board, like the Sunseed, obviously, because the minute that they activate Sowing, you definitely want to Ash there. You don't want things to push through and for these seeds to grow and get fertilized into a forest full of despair. So that's one thing to note. And then the last deck that I think actually has potentially a chance is maybe Vanquish. So the problem with this deck, guys, is after testing it, I found that this deck struggles a lot against big decks that put out big monsters. It doesn't have any good removal. It's a control deck that lacks a lot of removal. In fact, the only removal that's baked into their engine is basically Vanquish Soul Caesar Valius, and the way that you can turn this online a lot of the times is actually drawing out the game so you can amass resources into your hand, Earth, Fire, and Dark, so you can use the non-targeting pop effect. Other than that, you would rely on Raisin's effect, which would have to be special summoned to a position of a monster that you want to pop and then reveal a Fire in the Dark. But this deck also has consistency issues on top of what it does. Like, I found like you were bricking a lot. Like, none of the other cards are truly starters except Raisin itself, so you do probably have to play Small World or multiple pots in a last-ditch attempt to get to Raisin. It's a lot like Math Mech, only Math Mech is a lot easier because you can go to the XYZ to search Raisin, but Raisin is a card that you actually have to hard draw or use your other cards to get into, like your non-engine pieces, or stake your soul, right? Like, there's a lot of barriers to get to Raisin a lot of the times, and if you don't get to that across a 10-round tournament, if you're losing games, you're dropping games where you don't see Raisin because of the deck's consistency, then that's probably not a good sign. And then on top of that, again, it struggles with big monsters. Like against Branded, it's really hard for this deck to win against Branded because they're able to get a bunch of big monsters on board that replace themselves, a bunch of monsters like Mirror Jade, which nuke the board as well, so it's hard for them when they don't have a rock of the Vanquisher on the field to survive for the following turn, so they can continue extending and special summoning their monsters to take advantage of their opponent's turn and get the effects as well. The other thing is they also ran out of resources quite fast. You have Vanquish Soul Dust Devil, obviously, and then typically one of this, and then one of the Continue as well, as the only search targets for Mad Love, because these cards are bricks. You don't want to draw them typically. So it's kind of hard for this deck to win in the grind game as well. A lot of times there are better decks that still outgrind them, because even though you're able to add a lot of monsters, you're kind of bottlenecked by just having the Vanquish Soul Dragon monster, Caesar Valius, to pop per turn on top of the Raisin. So it's a lot harder to this deck to kind of clear boards and then also protect themselves on the following turn without playing cards like non-engine and hand traps. But the only nice thing I will say about this deck that's at the forefront is the fact that it has a in-engine themed Book of Moon that's very good against KASHTIRA. In fact, just like searching Dust Devil and booking a card, unless they have Birth and you have no way to stop them, this deck actually has a really good matchup against that KASHTIRA matchup. So I think that this deck could have a lot of chance to shine and potentially even win if a lot of people are playing KASHTIRA. So that's just one thing to take note of. Other than that, I think the only deck that we can really quickly talk about is Branded. I just don't think this deck has a good enough chance to win. It just struggles so much with Ash. I know the deck can play around Ash now with some of its in-engine. You can play things like Nadir Servant and other cards. However, any board plus Ash is what this deck struggles with. They can have the Ash for the Branded Fusion, and once Branded Fusion is taken out of the equation, it gets really hard for you to win, because with the rest of your engine pieces like Cartesia, Albaz, whatever you may have, it's often not enough against the power level, the modern power level of cards nowadays. So cards like Fenrir, Birth, even Fenrir and Birth on the field can make a Branded player sweat when Branded Fusion is out of the equation. When Branded Fusion gets ashed, what else are you going to use to get rid of the Fenrir and also mount a defense so your opponent can't win on the following turn? You might be able to clear the Fenrir, you might be able to put up a Mirror Jade if by some stroke of luck, however you do that, I'm not sure. But on the following turn, are you going to have enough defenses to protect against the onslaught of Birth plus Fenrir plus whatever else they have? I mean, the one Mirror Jade might have already used the effect to get rid of the Fenrir, or it might just have the one last fire of ammo that you use on the first monster they summon, but then they followed up with Birth or whatever, and then they're able to OTK you or build the more or less same board, and then you're kind of struggling again, right? So I feel like Ash is just so prevalent against this deck, and it really hurts to say. A lot of people are saying that Ash can actually beat Branded, like Branded can beat Ash Blossom now, but yes, it's true, but you cannot beat Ash plus a board, guys. It's not just Ash Blossom you're dealing with the entire board of whatever monsters are on the field. Even against Runicks, they could have multiple negates, have Sprite monsters, have an onslaught, have a follow-up, they're drawing multiple cards. So if you're not winning that turn without Branded Fusion, then you're probably not winning the game, right? So that's why I feel like Branded is probably not good enough to win, but maybe you guys can prove me wrong. Let me know below in the comments what you guys think. Other than that, I'm going to see you guys in the next video and definitely at the upcoming WCQ.